Today we will be looking at bankruptcy filing trends by chapter in the state of Vermont. To do this, we have about a dozen charts showing bankruptcy activity in the state going back to 1990. All of this filing data comes from the Administrative Office of the United States Courts. Now, this first chart shows total filings by year since 1990. And during that time, there have been 34,000 cases filed in Vermont. Generally, it was below 1,000 per year from 1990 to 1994. This jumped up quite a bit to between 1,500 and 2,000 per year from 1997 to 2004. Big increase in 2005, the year of bankruptcy reform, followed by a huge drop-off in 2006. This was followed by 4 years of increases, and this includes the Great Recession. And during this period, filings were up over 150%, and then they have dropped down by at least 60% since then. And so right now, filings in Vermont are about the same as they were back in 1990, and only half to a third of where they were in the years prior to bankruptcy reform. This map shows filings relative to population for each state, and the red-colored states have the very highest bankruptcy rates, and the yellow-colored ones have the very low rates. And Vermont is one of the very low ones, and actually they're second lowest in filings relative to population in the country. After the only one that has a lower rate is Alaska. You can see that in Vermont, the bankruptcy rate is about 1/4 of what it is relative to population in Tennessee, which is the perennial leader. Looking at this year by year, you can see that basically Vermont has been low every year. The gap seems to be getting wider, so it's been about 55% below average since 2009. But every year Vermont has one of the lowest rates in the country relative to population. Look at Chapter 7 cases, and this very much looks a lot like total filings. Under 1,000 per year back in the early 90s, averaged around 1,600 per year from, say, 1997 to 2004, and then the big run-up in 2005, followed by a nearly 80% drop the next year. Filings nearly tripled up into 2010, and then have been down 60% since then. So just as in total filings, Chapter 7 filings are about where they were back in 1990, and only a fraction of where they were prior to bankruptcy reform. This chart shows total Chapter 11 filings in the state, and back in the 90s through about 1997, filings were above 25 nearly every year. Have dropped off quite a bit. Since then, there's, since 2000, there's only been an average about 4 or 5 cases filed per year, and it looks like there's only been 4 filed in the state so far in 2016, so it won't be much different. Looking at Chapter 13 cases, you can see that back in the early 1990s, very low and averaged only about 50 per year. Big increases from the mid-1990s up until 2005. We got up to 300 per year. Drop off in 2006, and then increased with the recession hitting the peak year in 2009, and since then have dropped off quite a bit. And so now they're about the same as they were in 2000, but they are well above where they were back in the early 1990s. Now, this chart shows the percent of cases filed as Chapter 13s. The national average has been right around 30% for several decades, with some disruption before and after bankruptcy reform. In Vermont, generally throughout the 1990s, they were less than 10% of the cases there were filed as Chapter 13s. And in recent years, since say about 2009, Chapter 13s have comprised about 20% of the caseload, which is still well below the national average. Now, this chart shows the unemployment rate by quarter in Vermont since 2006. And the red is the national average. And you see that in Vermont, the rate has been well below the national average throughout this period. The gap was largest in the years during and just after the recession, where basically in Vermont they peaked at near 7%, where the national got up to around 10%. And but overall, things have been pretty steady, and now it's only a little over 3% in the state compared to around 5% nationwide. But it's certainly a smoother pattern than you see in most states, and definitely shows that the recession was not as may not have affected Vermonters as much as it did many other parts of the country. Now, since 2010 was when filings peaked most recently nationwide, and since then they've been dropping. Nationwide, the decrease has been 49%. In Vermont, the decrease actually has been 62%, which is one of the highest in the country. And you see the red states that have had the largest decreases tend to be most of New England and also the Southwest. And the smallest declines have been throughout the southeastern part of the United States. But Vermont certainly is near the top at over 60% decline. Looking at this quarter by quarter, the biggest declines were in Vermont were around 2011 and also 2014. Right now, we see kind of an unclear pattern where some up, some quarters up, some quarters down. Of course, in a state like Vermont that doesn't have many filings, it doesn't take much of a change. It doesn't take very many cases to change this chart, so it makes it very difficult to read exactly where it's going. But so far, in the first 6 months of 2016, filings are down nearly 11% in Vermont compared to about 6% nationwide. The white-colored states are the ones that are still showing declines, and there's only about a dozen of them left. What's interesting on here is the number of states that are red that are actually having increased filings right now. And there's about a dozen states where bankruptcies are going up, where if we looked at this a year or two ago, there wouldn't have been any states colored red. In the third quarter of 2016, filings in Vermont were down 17% over the same quarter last year. So I think for the outlook, it looks like there'll be below 600 cases filed this year in the state. I'm projecting modest increases in the coming years, but no return to the 1,500 to 2,000 cases that were filed per year from 1997 to 2004, unless some sort of legislative change or another recession hits. Well, that concludes our look at bankruptcy filings in Vermont. For more statistical information and other information on bankruptcy, be sure to visit the newsroom section of the ABI website at www.abi.org.